Well, thank you very much for that introduction, and everybody for coming out tonight. I'm very excited to share some of my favorite grisly Toronto history tales with you tonight. I'm sure if you're here, you know that tonight's talk is all about Toronto's most notorious murders. So my plan is to take us through the stories of 4 particularly infamous murders from the history of the city, and then one big mystery at the end, which might be a murder, but that's part of the mystery. Stories I think have a lot to teach us about the city. These are tales that are grisly and gruesome and morbidly entertaining, but I think illuminating too. That a lot of the stories of some of the most dramatic and even horrifying moments in any community's history really is a lot to teach you about that city and how it works and how it has worked for a long time. And so by sort of exploring some of these stories tonight, I think we're going to learn a little bit about the history of the city more broadly as well. So don't feel guilty for enjoying these murderous tales, is mostly what I mean. And these stories go all the way back to the very beginning, the very founding of the city. And one of Toronto's most notorious murders happened within just a few years of it being founded, back when Toronto looked like this. The muddy little town of York, just a few buildings scattered right along the lakeshore. Sort of the area around the St. Lawrence Market today was the first 10 blocks of the town. Muddy Front Street built right along the waterfront back then before we filled in a lot of that land. And just the first really couple hundred settlers living in this place where indigenous people had already been living for thousands of years. This is in 1796, so just 3 years after the town of York was founded. So the city was actually less built up than you see in this painting, just these few buildings on the muddy lakeshore. This is actually years after that, even 6 years or so after. This is the earliest image we can get. It's a story that happened one August night, that summer of 1796, when there were just a couple hundred settlers living here, not even a church yet built, while a group of men were moving through the darkness. Most of the settlers must have already been asleep that night. It was around about midnight when this group started making their way through the town along the lakeshore. A group of soldiers, the Queen's Rangers, all were worn green uniforms like this, their hats with their crescent moons. This isn't an image of Charles McEwen himself, our murderer, but he would have looked something like this, with a uniform like this. It's what the green coats of the Queen's Rangers looked like. And he had been stationed there to help build this colony, to help keep it safe, to help the people there prosper. The crime he was about to commit on the lakeshore that night would instead threaten to tear the colony apart. To understand just how horrific this crime was, it helps to rewind even a little further back in time to the founding of the city. So this is what Toronto looked like the week it was founded. So this is a view west across the lakeshore. Those are the forests of Toronto all along the right-hand side there, and the big Toronto Bay stretching out to our left. You can see a few details of what was happening in this founding week, July 1793, at a time when the British had just arrived in a place where, of course, there were already many people living, virtually the Wendat, the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. At this period, the Mississaugas, who were there when the British showed up to build this town. And there's one Mississauga leader in particular who'd been playing a leading role in the relationship between the British and the Mississaugas at this point for decades, Chief Wabikanam. He was a very respected Mississauga leader, they said, a tall man, very much a peacekeeper who helped lead through consensus. He'd been a vital ally of the British going back to the days of the American Revolution, when he helped the British fight against the American revolutionaries. And on the side of the Loyalists and the British, he helped fight in their battles and helped forge alliances with other First Nations and the British. And then in the decades since, he'd been a really important part of the treaty relationship between the British and the Mississaugas as the British looked to settle this land. Chief Wabauconine was one of the 3 Mississauga chiefs whose name appeared on the Toronto Purchase, which had been negotiated years earlier to try to pave the way for the city of today. It's a treaty that would prove to be wildly problematic, probably to the point of fraud. Years later, the founder of Toronto, John Graves Simcoe, would find that the Toronto Purchase, despite even having big differences between oral and written agreements and what the purchase meant, even the written document was just a blank deed that didn't even describe the land that they'd been negotiating over, and the names of the chiefs, including Wabauconine, had actually been signed on a separate piece of paper and then attached to that blank deed later. Simcoe and his boss decided not to tell the Mississaugas any of this, build their city anyway, and then renegotiate it all years later after weakening the Mississaugas by overfishing and overhunting and the unleashing of European diseases. So Chief Wabauconine was right in the middle of all of this, the negotiations that made Toronto possible. And he would have been a familiar face to the very early settlers after the town was founded. As I say, you can see some of the signs of what was happening in that founding week. Here, these are the masts of the British warships that had just sailed over from the temporary capital at Niagara. And to the right of them, the little white triangles and squares, those are the tents of the Queen's Rangers who'd been sent over ahead of time to begin construction on Fort York. And Charles McEwen was one of those Queen's Rangers who would have been stationed at Fort York in its very early days. And who is the one who was creeping through the town that night with his friends? Earlier that day, Chief Wabauconine had come to the settlement, to the area where there was an outdoor market, which is the same spot the St. Lawrence Market is today. He'd come to sell some salmon. Trading with the settlers was a big part of how the town thrived in the early days, the settlers trading with the local Mississaugas who traveled over from the mouth of the Credit River where their council fire was. And so Wabauconine had come with some other Mississaugas, including his wife and his sister, to trade salmon at the sort of precursor to the St. Lawrence Market, and then they spent the night there right by the lakeshore. And that's where Charles McEwen headed to go find them. According to the story that I think he told later, certainly that our historical sources suggest, earlier that day, Charles McEwen had propositioned Wabauconine's sister and had promised her some whiskey and I think a shilling in return for sexual favors. And now, at night, McEwen had come to collect by force if necessary. So he found the Mississaugas, including Wabauconine, his wife and sister, asleep on the lakeshore under their canoes. And Wabauconine was woken by the sound of what McEwen was doing, which was dragging Wabauconine's sister out from under her canoe by force. And Wabauconine, still groggily waking up, you'd imagine, stumbled over to try to protect his sister, at which point Charles McEwen, the Queen's Ranger, grabbed a stone and hit Wabauconine over the head with it, and not hard enough to give him a fatal wound. He then scuffled with Wabauconine's wife as well, who was also there to defend the woman being attacked, and in that scuffle gave her enough of a wound that it would kill her eventually as well. Wabauconine and his wife were both taken back to the Credit River, where they both ended up passing away, having been murdered by Charles McEwen, the Queen's Ranger. It was, of course, a horrifying crime, and McEwen was arrested for it and set to be put on trial. He was shipped across the lake to Niagara, what's now Niagara-on-the-Lake, which was still the temporary capital while Toronto was being built and set to be put on trial for murder. Many Mississaugas showed up in the capital too, demanding justice for the crime. They petitioned the leader of the colony, this guy, Peter Russell, who was the interim governor for a while after Simcoe headed home to England. Russell is one of the most notorious figures in Toronto history, one of the slaveholders in the early days of the city. Now, he was in charge of things while Simcoe was gone, and he promised the Mississaugas that justice would be done. He reassured them, he told them that any man who was capable of murdering one of the Mississaugas would be capable of murdering a settler as well. So that it was in their interest to have justice carried out. That they need not be afraid, that the authorities would not do their utmost to find the murderer and punish him as he deserves. And so, as I say, McEwen was arrested and put on trial, but the trial was a farce. There were multiple witnesses who said they had seen the whole thing, had seen McEwen kill Wabakanine and his wife, but the defense and then the jury agreed that there was no actual evidence that Wabakanine was dead because he had gone home to his own community to die. And the Mississaugas, not exactly eager to take part in this colonial vision of justice that they didn't trust, weren't anxious to let the settlers come exhume his body to have the proof that he was dead. That was a step too far, and so in the end, Charles McEwen was just acquitted and set free. And it wasn't the first time that something like that had happened. Just a few years earlier in Kingston, pretty much the same thing had played out. A Mississauga man murdered, the murderer then not held to account for it, and it led to huge tensions, as you can imagine, between the settlers of Toronto and the Mississaugas. But for a while, it seemed like war was about to break out. There were stories of the Mississaugas meeting with Joseph Brant, the leader of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, to discuss an armed resistance, even rumors that they might be teaming up with the French and the Spanish to launch an invasion. Peter Russell was deeply afraid that the Mississaugas might attack the little town of York at any moment. They had 2 new block houses built to defend the town. Government officials started traveling around the colony with armed escorts. For a while, it seemed like this tension over the murder of Chief Wabakanine might boil over into violence. In the end, though, the whole thing sort of lost momentum. Peter Russell gave in to some of the demands Joseph Brant had to divide the Haudenosaunee from the Mississaugas. And in time, as I say, the Mississaugas were getting weakened by overfishing and overhunting. And eventually, those tensions didn't lead to war. And in fact, as I say, the settlers managed to get them to sign a second Toronto Purchase, which would then be in dispute for the next 200 years, not settled until 2010, when the city of Toronto finally paid the Mississaugas the value of the land in 1793's equivalent in modern dollars. And so in the end, it wasn't war between the settlers and the Mississaugas that proved to be the biggest threat to York. It was instead war with our neighbors on the other side of the border. Imagine that. Tensions between Canada and the United States. It had been one of the big fears of the founders of Toronto that the Americans might invade at any moment. So the old grudges of the American Revolution had never been settled. And so the defenses of York were finally used to protect the town when the Americans attacked during the War of 1812. And that whole war, which saw the Americans try to take Canadian territory, though you know, it didn't go particularly well for them, meant that the guy who lived out here was a particularly important figure in the history of Toronto. This is Toronto's first lighthouse, this big gray tower topped by the red ensign out on Gibraltar Point. It still stands in that same spot today. It's the oldest building in Toronto that's still in the spot where it was originally built. It's the second oldest lighthouse anywhere in Canada, and no less an authority than Lighthouse Digest magazine, which is a thing that exists. It says that the one in Nova Scotia that's older has been so thoroughly renovated over the years that maybe it shouldn't even count. Believe it or not, the oldest lighthouse in Canada might actually stand on the Toronto Islands. It's certainly the oldest anywhere on the Great Lakes. It was hugely important during the War of 1812. It's where a man named J.P. Radomüller kept the light burning during the war. Now, Radomüller, his story, starts on the other side of the ocean in Bavaria, in one of the German states, in the town of Ansbach. It was there that he started out his life as a farmer, pretty soon became a royal servant. This is the 1700s, the days when the British royal family is extremely German, still has a lot of ties to the German states, and so Radomüller ended up getting a job with the British in the British royal court of Mad King George III, who you might know from Jane Austen novels, from Bridgerton and the Queen Charlotte spin-off too. This is the court that J.P. Radomüller found himself in the middle of. At first, he seems to have hated it. He was attendant to the king's, I want to say, brother William, whose family members, some of them were horrible. One of them, everybody called the Contagion, because he was so awful to know. Radomüller eventually quit his job, went back home to Germany, but these were the days of the French Revolutionary Wars, and his hometown was suddenly caught up in the violence. He became a refugee and decided life in the British royal court was better than that, at least. And this time he got lucky. He ended up working for Prince Edward, the famous Prince Edward. Queen Victoria's dad, the guy who Prince Edward Island and Prince Edward County are named after, who loved Canada. He'd even visited the Simcoes at Niagara in its early days. And so, Prince Edward was actually even only visiting England at the time. He'd fallen off his horse and gotten horribly wounded. As soon as he was well enough, he headed back to the east coast of Canada, and he brought J.P. Radomüller with him. So Radomüller worked with him for a while, and when Prince Edward went back home to England, Radomüller stayed on. He worked for the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia for a while, but really longed to return to his days as a farmer. And he heard that the best farmland in this new continent, maybe, was in Upper Canada. It's now southern Ontario, and so eventually he decided to head out here, which is how J.P. Radomüller ended up in York in those early days when it was just those few scattered buildings along the lakeshore. For a while, he helped some German arrivals settle on Yonge Street, served as an interpreter between the government, the colonial authorities, and those German settlers, which means while we don't know what J.P. Radomüller looks like, which is why I've just used a silhouette, we actually do have his signature. So this is his actual handwriting from the late 1700s, early 1900s, signing government documents, serving as an interpreter, really earning the trust of the British colonial authorities here, so much so that they trusted him with one of the most important government posts in the colony, which was keeping watch at that lighthouse out on the island. The Gibraltar Point Lighthouse was essential to the safety of the ships moving in and out of Toronto Harbour. Incredibly dangerous waters to travel through. J.P. Radomüller would have lived in this little cottage near the base of the lighthouse with his wife and their daughter, Arabella, keeping that light burning up atop the lighthouse to make sure that those ships didn't get wrecked. This is the era when the War of 1812 was just about to break out. The clouds of war were on their way. When the Americans invaded, the lighthouse became even more important than it had been before. Lake Ontario was a battleground itself. There were horrifying, gruesome naval battles being waged on our waters. Both sides were rushing to build the biggest warships they could. and ports on both sides of the lake. Some of the biggest warships in the world were sailing on Lake Ontario, some bigger than the flagship Lord Nelson had used to defeat Napoleon at the Battle of Trafalgar. Horrifying, bloody battles. It's why pirates famously have eye patches and hooks for hands and peg legs, is because cannonballs and grape shot in these bloody naval battles would knock your limbs off, send shards of wood flying through the air and blind you. Some captains of the ships on Lake Ontario would paint their decks red so the blood would blend in, scatter sand, just soak it up like sawdust at a butcher's shop. And the two sides were pretty evenly matched. And if the Americans managed to get control of the lake, it would mean that they then had access to the St. Lawrence River. They could sail down past the Thousand Islands and go besiege Montreal or Quebec City, which were the big prizes. So one ship, one way or the other, could have pitched the balance of the war for Lake Ontario, which could have changed the outcome of the entire war. Which meant that getting ships in and out of Toronto's harbour safely, and since it was the capital of York, it was a pretty important port that had lots of activity. That was something that could win or lose the war. And back then, the Toronto Islands were still connected to the mainland. It was one long, thin sandbar. There was no eastern gap like we have today. There was only one way in. A narrow channel of the Western Gap. We'd have to sail right past the guns of Fort York, but also, dangerously, the shoals hidden beneath the water, the shallows that have wrecked countless ships in Toronto history. Sometimes out on Gibraltar Point today, the beach shifts and the wreckage of old ships reemerges from the beach and then gets swallowed up again. So, coming in and out of the harbor was something where a ship could really get wrecked and the whole war might be in the balance. So Radomüller had an incredibly important job out there at his lighthouse. But that's not to say that he didn't know how to enjoy himself either. Radomüller liked to brew beer in the German style, which made him very popular with the soldiers who were stationed in the capital at the time. They say that members of the Queen's Rangers used to visit him all the time. Some coming over from Fort York on the mainland, lots of them stationed at a blockhouse out on the islands. There's still, that area is called Blockhouse Bay to this day. Now, there are all sorts of versions of the story of how Radomüller ended his life, but we know it came right at the end of the war. In fact, the war was already over when Radomüller died. He just didn't know it. A peace treaty had been signed in Belgium at the end of 1814. These are still the days when it takes months for the news to cross the ocean, and Radomüller was dead by the time that good news reached the town of York. It's a story that's been passed down for generations now, and there are different versions of the tale, but the most common version goes something like this. Radomüller, used to entertaining those soldiers with his German beer, had a visit from two soldiers one night in those dying days of the war. Two guys named John. Everyone's a John or an Elizabeth back then. John Henry and John Bloman. They had a very nice night. I think maybe one of the first days of the new year in 1815, up until the point where Radomüller decided that the two Johns had had enough to drink and cut them off. And that when he did, when he took their beer away, John Bloman and John Henry flew into a rage, demanding more booze, and when Radomüller didn't give it to him, they grabbed whatever weapons they could find there and chased him across the sand, past his lightkeeper's cottage, all the way to the lighthouse itself, which is where he tried to take refuge. They chased him up the winding stairs to the very top of the lighthouse, where Radomüller is said to have made his final stand. But one of the Johns must have pushed him over the side, because Radomüller then fell all the way down the lighthouse, landing with a thud on the hard sand below. J.P. Rattlemuller, Toronto's first lightkeeper, had been murdered. The two Johns knew they were in deep trouble. The punishment for murder in the early 1800s is very much your own death. And so according to the stories, they decided to try to cover up their crime. And they did it in the most grisly fashion imaginable, which is that they decided to chop Rattlemuller's body up into pieces and then bury them all in various locations around the Toronto Islands, that sandbar back then, so that you'd never be able to find Rattlemuller's whole body at once and then pin the murder on them. And then they went into hiding and ran away, hoping to evade the authorities even if Rattlemuller's body was uncovered. And so, it's one of Toronto's most famous ghost stories today, as you can imagine, is that on some misty nights, if you're out there on Gibraltar Point, looking up at the lighthouse, you might see a light burning up top, even though it's been decommissioned for decades at this point. You might hear a moaning, which some would say sounds like a pigeon, but others would say is definitely, absolutely a ghost. And then if you're really lucky, or unlucky, depending on your opinion of such things, you might even come across Rattlemuller himself, his spirit wandering through the mists, floating above the sand, searching for the limbs that have been hacked off him after death. Now, ghost stories have been passed down, as I say, for generations, especially through the families that looked after the lighthouse. I've had several light-keeping families over the decades, and that story got handed down through all of them, all the way up to modern times. For most of the city's history, people have assumed that the entire story was made up. One of the city's first big historians, John Ross Robertson, at the end of the 1800s, said that as far as he could tell from his research, the entire story of the murder was a fairy tale, just a fun story that people passed down. It wasn't until recent years that researchers uncovered evidence that J.P. Rattlemuller really was murdered, and that at least that part of the story is very much true. We found a newspaper article from the time talking about the mysterious disappearance of the first lightkeeper and John Henry and John Bowman being arrested for his murder. So we know that at least part of that oral history of the settlers of Toronto is true. And it's such a beloved story that it became kind of an officially embraced part of the history of the lighthouse. It was decommissioned in the 1950s, and they put up a new plaque on the side of the building that you'll still find there today. And as far as I can tell, it's the only plaque in the entire city of Toronto that references the ghost story associated with the building as part of its official history. It says that when, in more recent decades, a jawbone was found in a shoebox buried in the sand nearby, people assumed it must be Rattlemuller's, and that's just lent credence to the ghost story that people tell about this building. And that line about the ghost story made this one of the most controversial plaques from its era of Toronto history. When the historical organization decided to put it up, there was outrage at Metro Council. Some councillors thought that mentioning the ghost story associated with this lighthouse was far too terrifying for children, and that they would never want to go anywhere near that spot on the island. A councillor who I imagine has never met a child in their entire lives. This made the lighthouse incredibly popular with children, but there is this spooky, grisly story associated with it, and one that I think has a lot to teach us about the city in the War of 1812 too. And in the decades to come, the city grew and boomed, of course. Toronto's been growing at an incredible rate ever since it was founded, from the days when it was just those few buildings along the muddy waterfront into a big Victorian metropolis. In the middle of the 1800s, it was full of church spires and Small Victorian buildings all over the place. The first railroads had arrived by this point in the 1850s that just helped keep it growing from there. So that by the end of the 1800s, it was really a big, booming Victorian metropolis, the harbor filled with steamships, new buildings going up all the time, and all of what's kind of now the downtown old city of Toronto core was getting built up. And it was this point, in the 1890s, that one of the most notorious murderers, not just in Toronto history, but in North American history, arrived in our city. It was in 1894 that a man named Herman Webster Mudgett pulled into Toronto on a train, presumably getting off at the old Union Station. He was a pharmacist originally by trade, but in truth, his real profession was as a con artist. And the name he went by the time he arrived in Toronto, wasn't his real name, Herman Webster Mudgett. By then he was going by his alias, Dr. Henry Howard Holmes, better known as H.H. Holmes. Some have called him the first American serial killer, though that doesn't quite seem to be accurate. The Globe, writing about him in the late 1800s, went more simply with a wolf in human shape. His crimes were absolutely heinous, horrifying, and they captivated the world in the late 1800s. He was making headlines not long after Jack the Ripper was doing the same in England, and he had a similar effect here. His life of crime had really gotten started when he was at university in Michigan. And it was there as a student that he really got started as a con artist. He teamed up with one of his professors in medical school to start body snatching. This was a big deal. In the late 1800s, medical schools, there were more med students than there were corpses to learn on. And so body snatchers like H.H. Holmes and his professor would sneak into cemeteries at night, dig up bodies, and then sell them off to med students. This happened in Michigan. It happened here too. There are horrifying stories of bodies being dug up in cemeteries in towns like Fergus and then getting taken into Toronto in suspiciously smelly trunks oozing blood into Union Station to be taken to the Toronto Medical School. Horrifying tales of farmers up Yonge Street chasing body snatchers down the road in the dead of the night. This is how H.H. Holmes seems to have gotten started. And since they, I guess, weren't making enough money off the bodies selling them themselves, they then started using them in insurance fraud schemes, taking out life insurance on people and then pretending the corpse that they'd dug up was that person in order to cash in on the policy. That was just the beginning for H.H. Holmes. His crimes are so, the list is so long and so complicated that to this day, we're not even entirely sure how many people H.H. Holmes ended up ripping off and how many he ended up murdering as well. He eventually ended up in Chicago. By then, he had married 3 different women, all at the same time. Just one more con that he seems to have been pulling. And it's in Chicago that his most notorious crimes really got started, where we think the murders began. There are all sorts of candidates for murder. A lot of them sort of revolved around this building. It would become one of the most notorious buildings in Chicago history because of the myths surrounding it and H.H. Holmes. It was the pharmacy that he built, but 3 stories high. As you can see, the top level is also unfinished. It would never be finished. It's part of what makes the building so notorious. It was people who worked with him here or knew him during this period who began disappearing suspiciously. To this day, we're not sure exactly how many of them just left, how many he murdered and buried somewhere. Many candidates were women he was sleeping with, beginning with one of his first mistresses, or first, Julia, who left her husband to join H.H. Holmes there at his pharmacy in Chicago, brought her daughter Pearl along with her. They both disappeared. H.H. Holmes would later confess to their murders, and the body of a child was found buried in the dirt basement of the building. So probably Pearl Connor, though he seems to have killed so many people, it could even be someone else. Then there was another woman we think was his mistress, Emmeline Segron. She disappeared as well, quite possibly murdered by H.H. Holmes. Then another mistress, Minnie Williams, who brought her sister along. Anna wrote a letter to her family saying they didn't need to worry about her anymore. This nice man, Dr. Holmes, had promised to look after her and her sister, so her family didn't need to worry about her anymore, which technically was true. And Minnie both disappeared, almost certainly murdered by H.H. Holmes. But it's when he teamed up with this guy that he would end up making really big headlines. Benjamin Pitezel was, I think, his assistant and a carpenter who I think he first hired to help him build this new building, but then they started doing the same kind of insurance schemes that H.H. Holmes had done with his professor in Michigan, getting bodies and taking out policies on them. At one point, they decided they'd take out a policy on Benjamin Pitezel himself, and then get a corpse and pretend it was him while he lay low and went into hiding, and then they'd cash in on this big life insurance policy. But when it came time to get the body, H.H. Holmes maybe had some trouble getting his hands on one, or decided that that part of it was all too much of a bother, and really the more simple thing to do, obviously, would just be to kill Benjamin Pitezel and show the actual corpse of the guy the life insurance policy had been taken out on. And so that's what happened. A lot of H.H. Holmes's behaviors, even if you're on board with the murders, don't seem to make a lot of sense. And this seems to be one of the examples to me. He ends up burning Benjamin Pitezel's corpse before trying to turn it in for the life insurance policy, which just seems like that would hurt with the identification. He then seems to have chloroformed the body after burning it, maybe trying to make it seem like a suicide, but he'd done it all in the wrong order, none of which ended up being something he could pull off. And that's before stuff starts getting really weird. The weird stuff begins because H.H. Holmes managed to convince Pitezel's widow to let him look after 3 of their 5 children. And then H.H. Holmes started taking them on a bizarre road trip, using the new railways to travel around the northeastern United States from city to city. So, he's got the 3 Pitezel children he's responsible for, Alice, Howard, and Nellie. But those aren't the only people he's traveling with. He's also using a parallel path to travel at the same time with their mother, the widow of Benjamin Pitezel, Carrie, who he's staying with in the same cities as the kids, but at a separate location, at a different hotel, and they're not telling the mom and the kids that they're all in the same city at the same time, for some reason. And then, at the same time he's doing that, he's also traveling with a third party, his third wife, Georgina, at a third hotel, and he's not telling her what's going on with the Pitezel kids or the widow either. The idea behind which I'm not entirely clear on, but that must have made his life unbelievably complicated as he traveled from city to city in the weeks to come. He started out in Chicago for a brief visit before heading to Cincinnati. Then he was in Indianapolis, headed up to Detroit, and that's when he crossed the border into Canada and took a train to Union Station with 2 of the Pitezel children and set up shop in Toronto. By this point, he was only in Toronto with the 2 Pitezel girls. By this point, he had already murdered Henry. He'd done it in Indianapolis in pretty brutal fashion. I think briefly while staying there, had maybe poisoned him, if I'm remembering correctly. It's hard to even keep track of all of the ways H.H. Holmes is killing people. This is where he stayed in Toronto with the kids. In addition to 2 hotels with the other women, he rented this house on what back then was called Vincent Street. It's now become part of what Bay Street is today. So this little tiny sort of Victorian bungalow which stood right where Hospital Row is today. So like around Sick Kids in Toronto General, not far from Queen's Park, that's where H.H. Holmes kept the 2 Peitzel girls and where he murdered them. We do know the details of that. He would confess to it later. He said he put them both in a trunk and then fed a hose through a hole and poisoned them inside, and then buried them beneath the dirt floor of the cellar, borrowing this exact shovel from the neighbor to do it. He then carried on with his trip, now without the children, I guess with the 2 women, headed to Philadelphia eventually, which is where the police finally caught up with him. An American detective had been on his trail, had finally tracked him down and arrested him, and then tried to trace his footsteps backward, leading him eventually to Toronto, and eventually to that same house on Vincent Street where he murdered the 2 girls. That detective then borrowed the same shovel from the same neighbor to go digging in the basement to dig up the cellar, and had a very striking description of the odor as he dug down through the floor, getting stronger and stronger until he uncovered the forearm of one of the Peitzel girls he knew he'd found what he was looking for. And so, of course, the H.H. Holmes murders became this huge news story, especially in the wake of the sensationalist tales of Jack the Ripper in England. So H.H. Holmes had been arrested and put on trial. This is his infamous mugshot. And that's where things started getting even more confused and clouded than they had been before. Because H.H. Holmes seems maybe to have enjoyed the attention, so he started confessing to murders endlessly. Way more people than he ever could have possibly killed. There were people he was saying he'd murdered who then turned up very much alive, explaining that they had not been murdered by H.H. Holmes. But it got a hold of the press. So this headline says he confessed to 27 murders. Before long, the media was saying it was something maybe north of 200. And they were telling big stories even beyond that. So when Holmes was finally hanged for the murders, it's actually not even entirely clear how many murders he was really being hanged for, because we have no clue how many people H.H. Holmes killed. Since then, the layers of myths have only gotten deeper. The media didn't stop at the 200 murders. They also started spinning tales about Chicago at the time, because H.H. Holmes had had particularly notable timing. While he was doing these murders, it was also the World's Fair in Chicago, one of maybe the single most famous World's Fair in world history. Huge numbers of people were coming to Chicago. And when H.H. Holmes built that building for his pharmacy, he got in investors by claiming that the top floor, at least, he was going to turn into a hotel for all the tourists. And when the media heard that, they decided that obviously the only reason he could be doing that is to turn his hotel into a murder hotel. And so it became nicknamed H.H. Holmes's Murder Castle. And the media started making up all sorts of stories about all the secret chambers that H.H. Holmes had built into it. Rooms that were specifically hooked up with poison gas for disposing of bodies, maps of the interior. He actually did have some secret rooms inside, but they seem to have actually been used for hiding furniture that he had no intention of paying for after buying on credit, not for the murders that he was very much carrying out, just not the way the media was saying or to the extent that they were. And so those stories have kind of lived on ever since. H.H. Holmes became a whole industry. It also was a deadly industry. At least one life was claimed by those stories. One of the guys who had helped work on the construction of the building killed himself not long after these sensationalist media tales. The media said because he was so crushed by the guilt of having helped build what he thought was a murder castle that wasn't actually a murder castle at all. And so, as I say, it's a whole industry even to this day. You can buy board games that are laid out maps of the murder castle. I think there's a tiny little cartoon, H.H. Holmes dragging a body down the stairs in there somewhere. On maybe the anniversary of the World's Fair or some notable dates, there are hotels in Chicago that will let you book an H.H. Holmes themed room, just in case you sleep better at night thinking a serial killer is coming to get you. They lay out bones on a bedside. There's a silhouette of H.H. Holmes in the window, and they'll have a copy of the book that made the story the most famous, which is a recent book, The Devil in the White City, which very much repeats the mythology. Delicious story, disturbing one that it is, but it's filled a lot with sort of the fictional version of the murder castle. For a while they were going to turn it into a TV show, I think with Keanu Reeves and Martin Scorsese. I'm not sure if it's going to go ahead or not, but H.H. Holmes has become sort of this myth of the first American serial killer and the owner of the murder castle. And the last murders he ever committed was killing those two pizza girls in Toronto back in 1894. He became such a thing that we've even got photos of his skull. Scientists decided to dig up his grave. They found it strange, just as everything with H.H. Holmes is. They dug down and found a coffin filled with concrete and no body, which must have been very exciting. They kept digging and found a second coffin with concrete and a body. They found H.H. Holmes inside, still wearing his suit, well preserved enough that his mustache was still on his skull. He'd apparently asked to be buried that way to protect his body and help preserve it. Beneath the water table, encased in concrete, scientists decided they wanted, to study more about serial killers, so dug up his skull, took photos of it, maybe took some samples, and then presumably put it back down there. The stranger elements of a deeply strange story. Now, Toronto, of course, kept growing from there, and despite the fact that every story I've told you today suggests that Toronto was never an innocent place, it wasn't until the 1970s, when the Yonge Street Strip was a cacophony of neon lights and body rub parlors and strip clubs, that the murder people most often point to as being the one where Toronto lost its innocence took place. Some of you, I imagine, may even remember the stories of it. It comes from a time when Yonge Street was one of the most notorious places in Toronto, filled with sort of sex industry type shops. The early strip clubs, some of which are still around today, like Zanzibar, drawing protesters in the old days of Toronto the good, demanding that pornography must go. My favorite depiction of it is from the artist William Kurelek. If you know his work, it appears in the National Gallery and the AGO. It's mostly sort of delightful scenes of Canadiana, kids having snowball fights on the prairies, farm shots. He also, Kurelek, was a deeply disturbed man who became an avowed Catholic. So he also has a whole series of paintings sort of about his religious visions of an apocalypse and his religious rage. So the Yonge Street Strip to him, he painted like this. He titled this painting, He Gloats. The he in this situation being Satan, the devil himself. This is the Yonge Street Strip filled with souls that the devil, as a farmer, is harvesting off of the strip to send to hell. This is how some people saw the Yonge Street Strip back in the 1970s, as souls being collected by a tractor. And those opinions really came to a head over another one of the city's most notorious and heartbreaking murders. It was the murder of a shoe shine boy, Emmanuel Jacques. I see nodding heads, some of you absolutely remember this. Jacques was only 12 years old, and he worked by himself on the sidewalk there young in Dundas, shining shoes. He was approached one day by a man who bought him a hamburger and offered him a job moving some photography equipment. It was the last time anyone who knew Emmanuel Jacques ever saw him again. His body was found on the roof of one of those buildings across from the Eden Center in a garbage bag. Just, I think, days later, he'd been drowned in a tub, sexually assaulted, first injected with needles. It's truly a deeply unsettling and horrifying crime. And there's a huge mourning across the city from people outraged by this crime. Even the mayor, David Crombie, said the Yonge Street Strip in the wake of this was a yawning cesspool that needed to be cleaned up. And people were outraged that he'd been allowed to die this horrible, horrible death. Tragic enough that some of you still remember it, 50 years later. 4,000 people turned up to his funeral, another big public event, heartbreaking. The pallbearers were all friends of his, all young boys themselves. But those feelings of outrage over his murder also turned ugly. There were people there who, when they found out that the murderers were gay men, became viciously homophobic over the murders as well. At public demonstrations, people were demanding death to all sex criminals, and some of that outrage was being put on perfectly innocent LGBTQ plus Torontonians as well. There was a petition making the rounds at one of the protests that called for all gays and body rub parlors to be stamped out, and it got more than 1,000 signatures. And they helped set the scene for the cleanup of the Yonge Street Strip. The government moved in, started shutting down businesses. Dozens of them had closed within, I think, just a few weeks, though, of course, many of them survived and are still around today. And it sort of set the groundwork for some of the city's most notorious homophobic acts in the years to come, too. This is just 4 years before the infamous bathhouse raids in Toronto, when Toronto police brutally cracked down on gay bathhouses, arresting men, hurling homophobic slurs at them, treating them brutally, part of what drove a wedge between the police and Toronto's LGBTQ plus communities that still continues to this day, and has been made worse, of course, by recent murders too, as we all know. But when a serial killer was operating in Toronto's gay village, Bruce McArthur, for years people there were begging the police to do something about it. They didn't believe there was a serial killer, though it turns out Bruce McArthur was actually the most deadly serial killer in all of Toronto history. Though there's been good and pushback too. The bathhouse raids led to a big protest march down Yonge Street, which today is recognized as the first official Pride parade in Toronto history. Though the roots of the Pride event itself you can trace back to the 40s and 50s, and gay communities hanging out on Hanlon's Beach, where they're now the clothing optional beach, sort of in the shadow of the lighthouse where Rathmuller was killed 200 years ago. Two of the men who were in that protest march were then celebrated at Pride in more recent years, because they became the first couple to get married after the Supreme Court struck down the law against same-sex marriage. They got the news at Osgoode Hall and then ran around the corner to the courthouse on University, got married in a supply closet before the government could appeal the decision in front of the world's media and the custodial staff, I think in 2003. So all these murders, I think, have a ton to reveal about sort of the city and how it works, because they are moments of deep emotion and deep sort of fracture in the city's psyche. And there's one last story I want to tell you before I send you home to bed, where I'm sure you won't have a single nightmare. It's the story I promised you about maybe Toronto's single most infamous mystery. It takes place when the city looked like this. The era after the First World War. Shops and signs all along Yonge Street here in 1919. It's a story some of you might know because the anniversary was 6 years ago. So a couple of books were written about this particular mystery on the anniversary. It all revolves around this theater, the Grand Opera House, which was the big opera house that stood back then on King Street, where University cuts through today. Before University was extended south to Union Station, there was this big opera house in the middle of the street that was later demolished. And it was owned by Toronto and really Ontario's big theater tycoon. This guy, Ambrose Small. He owned theaters all over southern Ontario. His Grand Theatre is still in London, Ontario today, haunted, they say, by his ghost. Though, as a Torontonian, I kind of like to think he might be haunting Toronto somewhere. He, in 1919, decided to sell off his theater empire, all of it, in one big go. The economy was kind of rough after the First World War, and movies were becoming more and more popular. He could see things shifting, decided to get out of the business while business was still good, and so sold off his entire empire in 1919 for the sum of, I believe, $1.75 million, which today would be about $30 million. Enough, obviously, to make him comfortable for the rest of his life. This is the Grand Opera House from the outside. He signed the deal, I believe, there at the Opera House, and then headed out, as you can imagine, to have a pretty good time that night. He probably went to the city's speakeasies to drink illegally in those days of Prohibition, and was seen boasting to everyone about the deal he had just made. In fact, he was telling everyone that he had a check there in his pocket for the lion's share of the fortune. A check for $1 million. The first such check in Toronto history, I think Canadian history. He partied all that night, the $1 million check there in his pocket, somehow survived that night, and the next day headed downtown to deposit the check in the Dominion Bank, which is right here at Yonge and King Street. Still there today, this building. Today it's 1 King West, so there's a condo/hotel tower on top of it. It's kind of shaped as a fig. But the bank itself is still there on the bottom, right by King Station. The mezzanine floor is now a big bar, which is the longest bar in Toronto because it's the old bank teller's desk. In the basement, you'll still find the giant vault and the vault door. It's kind of hidden in the subterranean part, kind of connected to the path, which is where the money backing up that check would have been kept. He deposited the check, then headed to the Grand Opera House, took care of some things in his office, was last spotted that afternoon in his office, I think heading out maybe for the night, and then was never seen again. Just vanished off the streets of Toronto. One of the richest, most famous men in the city, just gone into thin air. He wasn't reported as missing for weeks. And that's because Ambrose Small was a party boy. He was known to be a big drinker, a big carouser. He had gone on weeks-long benders before, and so people didn't think much of it when he just disappeared yet again. They figured he was just off celebrating this new deal. So it wasn't until weeks later that people started thinking it was starting to get a bit far along, and people started actively searching for him. He was due home that night for dinner, but had never shown up. And in the wake of his reported disappearance, it then became a massive news story. People started hunting for him all over, really, the world. There were all sorts of suspects in his disappearance. People figured there was a very good chance he'd been murdered over this deal that he had signed just the other day. It didn't make sense that he would have disappeared himself, run away from his wife, because he had deposited that check and then left it there. He hadn't withdrawn any of the money at all, so if he was looking to cash in and get out of town, he would have taken the fortune with him. A lot of fingers have pointed at his wife, Teresa Small. They lived together here in Rosedale, in this house. The police even showed up at the home and started pulling up the floorboards, thinking they might find Ambrose Small's body under the floors, but never found any evidence that could definitely be pinned on her. We know they had a deeply tempestuous relationship. Ambrose Small was going on those benders. He was sleeping with a bunch of other women. He actually had a secret room in the Grand Opera House off his office, I think, where he could carry on some of his illicit affairs. She was mad over the deal, in fact. We know that she had almost scuttled it right at the last moment, and we don't know whether the deal they finally did hammer out made both sides happy or not. So, as I say, a couple of books came out on the 100th anniversary. I've talked to both of those authors and asked them who they think did it. One of them thinks Teresa Small is someone who at the very least knew more than she ever told the police. There's also the fact that Teresa would have been mad over this woman, Clara Smith, who was sort of Ambrose Small's main mistress, was herself a deeply jealous woman. We have her letters to Ambrose Small, where she is raging with jealousy, very sort of protective of his time and attention. In at least one of those letters, she's apologizing for having hit him, so a little physically carried away from time to time, though most people don't think she likely was the one who murdered him, if anyone did. One of the other authors immediately pointed to this man, Jack Dowdy, or Dowdy, I think it is, his personal secretary, so sort of his right-hand man, who was, we know, a disgruntled employee. He felt like he deserved some sort of big bonus when Ambrose Small sold off that empire and hadn't got it, which is enough reason to think he might have had a motive. But even more suspicious than that, he disappeared just a few weeks after Ambrose Small disappeared, and then turned up in the United States, having stolen $100,000 worth of bonds out of Ambrose Small's safety deposit box at the Dominion Bank. So we know he was at the very least a criminal, and he was put on trial for the theft of the bonds, but they never found any evidence that he was involved in the disappearance. So in the end, we're just left with little threads and theories. At one point, Torontonians got in touch with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, trying to get the creator of Sherlock Holmes to solve the mystery. He pointed out that what he did was create fictional mysteries, not solve real-life mysteries, and that he couldn't help. People have pointed all sorts of clues. His office at the Grand Opera House was found in disarray. One of his chairs was knocked over. There are papers around. Was there a scuffle? Was he dragged off and kidnapped for ransom money? But if that's true, why did no one ever ask for the ransom, which is a pretty important part of your ransom money kidnapping scheme?
Who got the $1 million?
Teresa seems to have kept the money because she was the inheritor of the estate. So, was it Teresa? Lots of people point to her. And in fact, that's easily her and Jack Dowdy. Could they even have gone in on it together? There were lots of strange theories, though, too. For years and years to come, it would come back up into the newspapers. The Ontario police actually relaunched the investigation 20 years later, in the 1930s. There were strange little bits of tantalizing evidence. The strangest, I think, is the mystery of the Des Moines man, who was found in, as you would imagine, Des Moines, brought into a hospital, seriously wounded. The guy bringing him in said he had just been hit by a car. Both his legs had been sheared off. He was deeply wounded, and his memory was gone, wiped. We brought him into the hospital, claimed he'd been hit by a car. Doctors thought the gunshot wound in his neck suggested that maybe there was something more going on. And his connection to Ambrose Small was that he looked like a dead ringer for Ambrose Small, and claimed his name was Jack Dowdy. So could have been Ambrose Small remembering things wrongly? When someone showed him a photo of Ambrose Small, he said, yes, that's me. But in the end, nothing really connecting him to Toronto or to Ambrose Small or Jack Dowdy was ever uncovered. And so today, there are lots of theories about where Ambrose Small showed up. One of them suggests that yes, Teresa, maybe Jack as an accomplice, had something to do with it. And then they, much like John Henry and John Bloman had done on Gibraltar's Point, tried to cover up their crime by chopping Ambrose Small's body up into pieces, and that his torso ended up here in a garbage dump in the Rosedale Ravine. And if you're looking for at least part of Ambrose Small today, then maybe he's there somewhere, not far from Sherburne Station in the Don Valley, buried beneath the earth where thousands of people commute every day. So, as you see, that's just one story among countless mysteries and murders in the city's past. And, as I say, I think they all have a lot to teach us about a community. These mysteries, these murders, these big dramatic events. So, I want to thank you all so much for listening to all of that. The Toronto Book of the Dead and the Toronto Book of Love, both of which I can touch on some of the stories we shared tonight. I have a weekly-ish Toronto history newsletter, the Toronto Time Traveler, which is filled with heritage news and events and stories all the time. You can subscribe for free and keep up on all my work. As Mark showed us the trailer, I'm also the host of the Canadiana documentary series, which is all free to watch on YouTube. You just have to search Canadiana. Yeah.
On that Canadiana series, what was the most interesting thing you come upon in Canada that you knew absolutely nothing about before you ran into it?
Oh, that's a very good, big question. What is the most interesting thing in Canada? Oh boy. One of my favorites, the first one that leaps to mind anyway, is the story of Sudbury, a place you don't immediately think of really rich history. You think Mordor and mines. So Sudbury now is beautiful and regreened, and there's one mine, one of the deepest in the world in Sudbury, where we went to go film 2 kilometers beneath the surface of the Earth, where they have a neutrino observatory. It's part of a Nobel Prize winning investigation into the cosmos, into neutrinos, trying to detect them, help detect them for the very first time. But in digging into that story, no pun intended, we also were learning about the history of Sudbury and why it's there in the first place. Why is all that nickel in Sudbury? And it's all because of getting hit by a comet billions of years ago that left a huge crater where Sudbury is today. And it filled with nickel, which is why it's all the mines. And the really interesting thing about it is that you can still see the rim of the crater in Sudbury today. There are waterfalls down the side of it. There's an A.Y. Jackson Point, which has a lookout over this waterfall. It's cascading down the old crater rim. And if you hike on some of the paths, you can actually see written into the rock itself the shock waves from the blast from the comet hitting the ground, because the force was so strong that it shook the rock into the shockwave pattern. So you can point at the shockwave billions of years later. And a lot of that kind of ancient history of Canada is written into the ground in corners all over the country. We've got an up-and-coming episode about the first settlers finding dinosaurs on the prairies, how that kind of links into Canadian colonialism and stuff. We went and shot in the Badlands in Saskatchewan, where you can see the boundary, which you can find in places all over the world, which is the debris from the asteroid that killed all the dinosaurs that fell in places all over the Earth, that layer of ash from that impact. Dinosaur bones all found below it, no dinosaur bone ever found above it, so it's that layer of the extinction that you can also point to in the land. This is the line where that happened, which is extraordinary. But the whole country's endlessly filled with stories like that. I could go on literally for hours, which I guess is why we have the channel, so you can watch it without me running out of voice. Yes?
While everybody was watching that clip of Canadiana, I was, because I'm blind, was listening to the music. What is that piece that is used for the soundtrack?
That is some royalty-free, anonymous music, I think. It might be in the comments on the YouTube channel. I didn't do the music, so I'm not sure, but it will definitely be whatever we could get for free.
I love it, it's very cool.
It's neat, isn't it? It's nice and driving.
Yeah.
Very nice. I'm going to do in a few weeks, beginning of June, I have my Festival of Bizarre Toronto History coming up, which is lots of online events, so even if you're up here, you can take part. And on the weekend, if you want to drive into the city, we do walking tours around town. And you don't need to remember any of this. All my projects are on my website, which is just my name.com. If you're worried about remembering my name, I have a few bookmarks I might run out if everybody wants one, but feel free to grab one if you like. Another question?
What are your thoughts on the destroying of Yonge Street history that's going on today?
In
Downtown
physical...
Toronto, like I used to live in Toronto and I go down every so often and I try to spend time on Yonge Street because the history is disappearing so rapidly. I mean, I know they came up with a part of the plan was to have a lot of development on main streets, but you know, Yonge Street is where, I remember when the Jays won the World Series, we all went there. You know, and it's the loss of history on Yonge Street is unreal to me. I mean, the government is giving money to, there's money available in small towns to preserve even all these little buildings, and yet Yonge Street, the most important street in Canada, they're ripping it all down and putting up condos. It's crazy.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of tension about that, and I think you hit the nail on the head with a lot of that there is a push and pull. We're in a housing crisis, we need more places for people to live, and the zoning in Toronto is really restricted. There's only 5% of all of Toronto you're allowed to build apartment buildings on, and it's all the big main streets. So it's all Eglinton, Yonge. So already places where there are big buildings, lots of them that have played important roles in the city's history, and lots of them already have lots of housing in them, that are the ones you have to tear down to build even bigger buildings because you're not allowed to do it other places. So a lot of people are pushing for things like gentle density. You changed the laws just recently, so you can build a duplex or a triplex, 2 or 3 apartments in residential neighborhoods. People who own houses have a lot of sway at City Hall and don't like having even little apartment buildings in their neighborhoods. But if we open that up, maybe you wouldn't need to be tearing down the big historical streets like Yonge Street. And it is part of the evolution of the city is that stuff's always getting torn down and replaced. But Toronto is also a city that's done a very good job of not preserving a lot of its built history for a very long time now. So that what we do have left is maybe a little more precious than it might be in a city that's done a better job.
You walk down Yonge Street, I've been going there frequently, fairly recently, and you see a sign like, this is where, what is it, Club Buluno? Yeah, you know, and it's like, who cares? The building's been gone. You know, it's like, so there's a sign for nothing is there. You know, and then, but for me, the beginning of the end was when they tore down Sam, the record man, and they put up that monstrosity for Ryerson with, well, Toronto Metropolitan University now. You know, so it's kind of, anyway.
Well, the Sam the Record Man time's an interesting example too, because we saved the sign, and the university had promised to put it up in the original location, which they broke that promise pretty much immediately. So now it's, because of the commercial interests in the square, is way up at the top of a tower, so it's really tiny. So it's something I mention every once in a while when I get interviewed or something in the press. It'd be really nice if Yonge Dundas Square, St. Cofa Square now, was filled with some of these old signs and some of this history. It could be a central repository, but because of the commercial interests that kind of control the square, you know, it has potential to be a neon museum mixed with ads, but it tends to only be one or the other. It's also the site, if you're ever downtown, of one of the strangest museums in Toronto. It's really cool, but no one knows it's there. It's on the second floor of the Shoppers Drug Mart on the square. There's a Yonge Street Music History Museum, just tucked up there, next to like the makeup, is a bunch of artifacts from the Yonge Street music scene, which is an example too. The people who really passionately care about this history did an amazing job of carving out the space in the Shoppers. It used to be Friar's Tavern, which is where Bob Dylan went and saw the band play before he got them to be his backing band and stuff. But you kind of already have to know it's there to know it's there because it's hidden on the second floor of a pharmacy.
Sorry, I'm going on Thursday, so I'm going to check it out. The Shoppers Drug Mart?
The Shoppers Drug Mart on the square.
It's right
there.
on the square?
Yeah, it's an old Hard Rock Cafe.
Oh,
built
Hard
as
Rock
an
Cafe
action
is
place.
now, it's up somewhere, okay.
Yeah, along with every third building.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So one of your books is about death, and the other one's about love. Can you say something about that second book?
Yeah, they both tell the history of the city from before it was founded to today. A little bit like I tried to do today. A bunch of different stories. Each chapter is a different story. It kind of adds up to a whole history of the city. In the case of the Book of Love, it's all stories of romance and heartbreak and jealousy and scandal. That both sort of acts as a history of all of Toronto history, but also a history of changing attitudes toward love. And yeah, sort of adds up. Lots of yeah, fun, I think, passionate stories. History, as I know many of you already know, is too often told as dry dates and lists and events, and, names, but they're all living people with all these passions who had these torrid love affairs and jealousies and were fighting duels over the people they were falling in love with and stuff. So sort of helps, I hope, bring some of those passions to life and remind us that these are all three-dimensional living human beings just like us. Yes?
Have you ever looked into the Miriam McDowell disappearance?
I don't know that one, I don't think.
You know, there was a teenage girl that was mid-50s.
Huh?
Was out with her boyfriend and somebody took her out of her car and never seen again.
No, I haven't come across that one.
Really?
There's so many of them. Yeah, so many. This talk actually started as a whole 5-week course where it's 5 lectures filled with murders and disappearances. And even with all of that research, I still haven't come across that one. They're just endless. Sadly, in this case, I love the themes. It's nice to find endless stories. When it's murders, you kind of want the list to be as short as possible. Yes?
You ever think they're going to solve the Sherman murders?
I mean, that one, I think people will be writing about that for a very long time to come. That's going to be a part of Toronto history people are writing about in 100 years. And it seems like it's going to be hard. They forgot to get alibis and turn down the camera footage from across the street and stuff, so it feels like it's going to be hard to piece all the evidence together this late. But every once in a while, a cold case gets solved, and that one's not cold yet, so maybe, but it would be surprising at this point. So yeah, it's one I think that's going to be a part of Toronto history for generations to come. Gets told, and yeah, on the 100th anniversary of that, someone might write a book just like they did about Ambrose and all.
Any more? We're good? Okay.
Oh.
Oh, no, Janine.
Yeah, I was just thinking, what's the first one in murder in Toronto that was solved by DNA?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah, that would be an interesting one to know. I have no clue. I never thought to check that. But I think I probably will now.
Next year.